Welcome back, everyone. Today we're here to talk about one of the best comic book adaptations of the mid-2000s and one of the rare comic book movies to get an R rating. We're talking about 2005's Constantine, starring Keanu Reeves, Rachel Weisz, and Shia LaBeouf. Constantine very loosely adapts the DC Vertigo comic Hellblazer that follows the character of John Constantine. Now, before we go too deep into the video, I want to explain what I mean in the thumbnail when I say that this movie has almost nothing in common with the comics it's based on. What I'm saying is that for me, there are a few criteria that really sum up who the character John Constantine is in the comics. Number 1, he chain smokes. Number 2, he wears a tie, white shirt, and trench coat. Number 3, he's British. Number 4, he's blonde. And number 5, he's bi and loves to hook up with demons. And the version of the character found in 2005's Constantine really only manages to check off the first two criteria, and even then, his trench coat is the wrong color. So just to be absolutely crystal clear, I am not saying this is a bad movie. I'm just saying that as an adaptation of Hellblazer, it fails on several levels. But that doesn't matter because this movie fucking rocks. Okay, now that we've got all of that out of the way, let's talk about how 2005's Constantine came to be, what makes it a special movie, and its legacy 20 years later in 2025. Released a full 20 years ago in February of 2005, Constantine had an incredibly long journey from comic to screen. As early as 1998, Warner Brothers was interested in developing a Constantine movie, but not happy with the direction that any of the writers or directors they'd hired had come up with. Finally, the script landed with Frank Capello, who really tapped into the fundamental essence of what this movie is. It's a noir set in a nightmare reality where demons and angels are real and fighting a war behind the scenes. As for the director of this movie, Francis Lawrence, it's crazy to think that this was his first time directing a movie and that they let him direct a massive tentpole movie starring Keanu Reeves with a $100 million budget. But that's not to say that Francis was a newbie either. Up to this point in his career, he'd already done music videos for everyone from Bad Religion to Green Day to POD to Britney Spears to Justin Timberlake to Alanis Morissette and even fucking Beyonce. What I'm trying to say is that even though this was his first movie, Francis had already proven his chops. You don't get to work with the high quality talent that he was working with without being talented yourself. And in doing research for this video, I learned that Francis was able to secure the job after a 4-hour meeting with Keanu Reeves where he broke down his entire vision for the movie, including the story, side characters, and visual references, which I have to imagine was a lot of horror stuff from the 70s like The Exorcist, The Omen, or maybe even Suspiria. But also, this movie is essentially a noir. In fact, I'd say its visual language is borrowing more heavily from movies like The Maltese Falcon, Chinatown, and The Third Man than anything else. Look how this movie uses moody lighting and shadows. Shit, Keanu's even smoking the entire movie like a good detective should do in any noir. And even though this movie is not a direct adaptation of the comics, I think it fully nails the tone of who the character John Constantine is at his core. Yeah, he's an exorcist or whatever, but mostly he's a detective and he fucking hates the world and everyone in it. And I think Keanu fully inhabits this character. His nihilism and misanthropy just radiate out of every scene he's in. Every line of dialogue feels like he's annoyed to even be doing this shit. It sounds like Francis was able to get pretty much all of his first choices for a majority of the roles, and that the role that took the longest to cast was that of Angela/Isabel, and the role went to the wonderful Rachel Weisz. Side note, her American accent in this movie is like pretty solid. There are several things that really set this movie apart, not only from other superhero movies, but from the other movies of the era as well. For example, I still appreciate the fact that this movie is not an origin story. It plops us right in the middle of Constantine's world and then fills the world in around us. Honestly, the world building here is incredibly strong. It opens telling us about the movie's MacGuffin, the Spear of Destiny, which is one of my favorite MacGuffins in all of DC and Vertigo Comics lore. Side note, I like how this movie opens with this quote but doesn't tell us who said it. And I love the opening sequence with the man randomly stumbling across the Spear of Destiny. I just think it's a badass way to open a movie like this and make you think, okay, so what the hell is this movie going to be? Which takes us to our introduction of Constantine. I've always loved how he sets the cigarette down instead of putting it out because he expects to be done quickly enough that his cigarette won't have burned that much. And I love his disappointment when he sees that it went out. I do like his relationship with Chaz too, and I think the two have really solid chemistry and some great banter, but I do wish their relationship was fleshed out a little bit more than what we got. That being said, I really love our introduction to Chaz. It tells us everything we need to know about him. He idolizes Constantine, he's Constantine's driver, and he gets annoyed that he doesn't get to be in the game helping Constantine more. I really like how Chaz tries to chastise John for not telling him to move the car more, and John's response is simply, "I told you to move." Like, it's just this really great moment that tells us everything we need to know about their relationship, and I like how John tells him to take Alvarado, and his response is so catty and annoyed. Keanu's Constantine also has some pretty solid chemistry with Rachel Weisz's Angela. The two never kiss, but there are a few moments where she definitely thinks he's leaning in for a kiss, and then he does something completely different. And I do really like this scene where they flirt super heavily, where she asks if she needs to take her clothes off, and Constantine has to think about it for a minute. Just thought it was a really cute scene. There's also this really wonderful moment early on with Rachel Weisz where she goes to inspect her sister's body, and the camera kind of shifts to this angle, and the way her necklace drapes around her neck, it looks as if it's being pulled magnetically towards the body. And I think this is just one of those great little moments that really make a movie stand out for me. I think my favorite set piece in the entire movie is Papa Midnight's club, and even though I'm not a huge fan of A Perfect Circle, I do think their song that plays as John enters the club perfectly sets the mood. And I could be wrong, but is this the only needle drop in the movie? Let me know if I'm wrong in the comments. My only problem with Papa Midnight's nightclub is that I think it was a missed opportunity to get some of Constantine being a horny dude that loves to hook up with demons, but at the same time, it seems pretty clear that this version of Constantine doesn't really engage with demons the way that Constantine in the comics did. Speaking of Papa Midnight, shout out to Jimon Hansu, who absolutely nails Papa Midnight. I mean, he looks exactly like he does in the comics, and he acts pretty similar as well. And rounding out the side characters are John's two friends and confidants, Father Hennessy and Beeman. They each only get a couple of scenes in the movie, but I think they did a great job of fleshing John out as a character and showing the kind of broken people he surrounds himself with and relies on. It's clear all of these men have had close calls and they owe John in one way or another. Plus, the death of Father Hennessy is so fucking cool and ripped straight out of the comics. Let's also not skip out talking about Tilda Swinton as Gabriel. I love that they cast someone so androgynous, and I love the scene where we meet her, and I like how she leans in and you almost think she's going to kiss Constantine before reminding him, "You're fucked." This movie's depiction of hell, I think, is something really special as well. I really like this movie's concept that heaven and hell are hiding behind our everyday world, that it's not really so much up or down, it's more what door you cross through to get there. And the way that hell is just like a nuclear wasteland covered with these like Resident Evil looking ass creatures is fucking badass. I actually love this entire sequence with Constantine in hell, aside from this very obvious treadmill moment. Side note, I've got a real problem with treadmill shots used for running. Something I'm going to spend an absurd amount of time complaining about in a few weeks when I put up my review for Severance Season 2. But don't worry, that's literally the only thing I have to complain about with that show. So far, anyway. Okay, back to Constantine. I think that Constantine also has an incredibly strong conclusion. Basically, John has been beaten and the devil's son is about to be born into and inherit our world. So what does John do? He slits his wrists. Not to escape, but because he'd always heard a rumor that he was the only soul that Lucifer would come to Earth to collect himself. And I fucking love how Lucifer is portrayed in this movie. Now, Lucifer is a pretty prominent character throughout DC and Vertigo lore. They also gave him a TV show in the 2010s, which I only watched a little bit of, but my wife really liked it. My wife! Anyway, they got Peter Stormare to play Lucifer here, and I just think that's perfect casting. Though, I have to admit, I was shocked in doing research for this video to learn that he is Swedish and not Eastern European. I think he's just played so many Eastern European characters in his career that I just assumed he was. Anyway, I love the way he enters covered in dripping hot black tar while wearing an all-white suit. Basically, this entire ending sequence boils down to John telling on the bad guys before they can complete their plan. Lucifer is and always has been a very selfish character. He wants hell to take over the earth, but he wants to do it. He doesn't want his son to do it. And the entire conversation they have is just fucking fantastic. Like, I like when John goes to light a cigarette and can't because he cut his tendons when slicing his wrist, and then Lucifer just lights it for him. Okay, final thing about the ending of this movie that I love is the way that John flips off Lucifer as he's being pulled into heaven. I never realized it before, but this has to be what Rogan and those guys were referencing at the end of This Is the End, right? Like I said earlier, the main thing I appreciate about this movie is that it's not an origin story. Sure, we get an origin told to us by Constantine, but this movie is in no way, shape, or form an origin story. I also love that this was shot in Los Angeles proper and features a lot of the city throughout the movie. And this is kind of rare. For those of you that don't know, most movies that take place in LA or New York or really any major metropolitan city are rarely actually shot in those cities. Most of the time it's Toronto or Vancouver or Atlanta being faked for those cities. But not in Constantine. The grime of LA plays a big part in this movie's overall aesthetic, especially considering the way the movie uses orange, which I think is the color tone most associated with LA. And while not a character in the movie like you might expect from a movie set in and shot in LA, I do think the city provides the perfect backdrop for the movie. I also like that it rains in LA in this movie, because it fucking rains here. When I moved to LA about 4 years ago, it rained 2 inches the day I arrived, and just last week we had an insane atmospheric river covering us in rain for a few days. So it doesn't rain a lot, but it does rain, and it tends to rain pretty fucking hard when it does. And I'm from Washington, so trust me, I know about the fucking rain. But the big thing that makes this movie stand out and stand up to the superhero movies of today is its cinematography. It uses darkness and shadow like a proper noir film should, and these colors are just on another level. Like, I love this use of the green windows in John's apartment, and again, this film's use of orange and blue really make it stand out. This movie definitely came out in a post-Matrix world, and I think you can see some of that in the cinematography throughout the movie, but honestly it stands on its own 2 feet, and the movie reminds me of the most visually isn't the Matrix, it's Dark City. Sure, it's not quite as dark as Dark City, and it doesn't have the sci-fi elements that movie has, but the modern noir aesthetics really match up well here. And I don't mean to always pick on Marvel movies looking like concrete, but compare any scene in this movie to any scene from any movie in the MCU, and you tell me which one looks better. I think we all know the answer is this movie. So 20 years later, what is this movie's legacy? Honestly, it's become a full-blown cult classic. I know plenty of people that love and or like this movie that have never picked up a Hellblazer comic in their life, and honestly, that's pretty fucking sick. Although you should all go read some Hellblazer comics if you never have, they fucking rock. And a little over 10 years ago, there was a Constantine show that was released by NBC that was loosely tied to the Arrowverse that was much more comic accurate, but I seem to be the only person on earth who liked this show because it was canceled after only 13 episodes, so what are you gonna do? Side note, if you guys want me to do a video talking about that show, let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to revisit it. But seriously, I think in most people's minds, Keanu Reeves is the only Constantine, and that's pretty cool, especially when you consider that a movie like this could never be made today. Specifically, I'm talking about the fact that, like I said earlier, this is technically a bad adaptation of the character John Constantine. Studios would be fucking terrified to piss off the fanboys and make this movie today. However, because this movie has become such a cult favorite over the years, there have been rumblings of a sequel, but in the last couple of years, and really in the last couple of weeks even, it seems much closer to happening than ever before. But Keanu seems excited, and Francis seems excited, and more than that, they both seem incredibly hopeful that this movie will actually happen and get made in the next couple of years. And on top of that, it sounds like they may have permission to go for a full R rating on the sequel. The original film was meant to be rated PG-13, however, the MPAA, being the pieces of shit that they are, slapped Constantine with an R because, quote, people believe angels and demons are real. And that's coming directly from Francis Loris, who told the story recently on the Happy, Sad, Confused podcast with Josh Horowitz. Do you guys want to see a sequel to Constantine as bad as I do? Do you think this movie rocks as much as I do? Were you mad that I called it a bad adaptation? Let me know in the comments. Also, we just wrapped up our poll on what game I'll be playing next, and it looks like my next video game review will be for the remake of Resident Evil on Switch, so stay tuned for that in the next couple of weeks. I've been Brandon from Born to Rant, and if you've made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We release new videos every Thursday morning at 7 a.m. Pacific time. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.